That afternoon, my son called me sounding happier than I had heard him in years, and he told me he had just added his wife as a joint owner on my $480,000 investment account. The one I had spent 35 years building one paycheck at a time, one careful decision at a time. He said it like he was handing me a gift, like he expected me to cry with gratitude right there on the phone. He said, "That's what family does, right, Dad?" I looked at my computer screen, at the account that used to have exactly one name on it, and I said four words that made his laughter stop cold in his throat. I said, "Show me the account. My name is Harold Whitfield. I am 64 years old, and I have lived in Charlotte, North Carolina my entire life. For 35 years, I worked as a plant supervisor at Continental Fabricators, a metal parts factory off Wilkinson Boulevard, and for 35 years I did the same simple thing every single week without fail. I put money away. Not a lot at first, just $50 here, $100 there, whatever was left after the mortgage and the groceries and the two kids growing up in my house on Maple Ridge Drive. My wife Margaret used to tease me about it, said. I squeezed a dollar so hard Lincoln started sweating. She wasn't wrong. But that squeezing turned into something real over the decades, and by the time I retired at 61, that account at Carolina Trust Investments had grown into $480,000. Not because I got lucky, not because somebody handed it to me, because I showed up to work every single day for 35 years, and I did not spend money I did not need to spend. Margaret passed 6 years ago. Cancer, the slow kind that takes its time and makes you watch. I won't spend a lot of this story on that, because it is not what this story is about, but I want you to understand something before we go any further. After Margaret died, that account became more than numbers on a screen to me. It became the last thing she and I built together. Every dollar of it stacked up from years of Sunday dinners we didn't go out for and vacations we didn't take. It was proof that the two of us had done something right, and I guarded it the way you guard the last photograph of somebody you loved. I have two children. My daughter Megan lives 2 hours away in Raleigh, and she calls me every Sunday like clockwork, rain or shine. Has done that since the day Margaret died and never once missed a week. My son Ryan lives 15 minutes from me here in Charlotte, works as a regional sales manager for a medical supply company, and married a woman named Chloe about 4 years ago. I want to be fair here because I am not the kind of man who badmouths people without cause. Chloe was polite to me at first. She smiled at holidays. She called me Harold instead of Dad, which I noticed but never said anything about. Small things. The kind of things you tell yourself don't matter because you want your son to be happy, and for a long time I let myself believe that was enough. Let me back up further though, because you need to understand how a man like me, careful his whole life, disciplined his whole life, ended up sitting at his kitchen table on an ordinary Thursday afternoon, staring at a stranger's name attached to everything he had ever worked for. I started at Continental Fabricators in 1989, 27 years old, 2 years married to Margaret, and about as broke as a young man could be, without actually owing money he couldn't pay back. My father had worked in a textile mill his whole life, and retired with almost nothing to show for it, and I remember standing at his retirement party, watching him shake hands with men who had never once asked him what he needed, and I made myself a promise right there that I was not going to end up like that. I was not going to work 40 years and have nothing left over but a gold watch and a pat on the back. So when I got my first real paycheck at Continental, I opened an account at Carolina Trust and I put $50 into it before I did anything else. Rent, groceries, everything else came after that $50, not before. Margaret understood it the same way I did, because she grew up poor too, and we built our whole marriage around that one simple rule. Pay yourself first, and everything else figures itself out. It was not glamorous. We did not take fancy vacations. We drove our cars until the transmissions gave out. Megan and Ryan grew up thinking a trip to the beach at Myrtle for 4 days was the height of luxury, and honestly, watching their faces on that drive down Highway 17 every summer, I think it was. We were not deprived. We were careful. There is a difference, and it is a difference that matters to this story, because Chloe never once in 4 years understood it. By the time Ryan was in high school, that account had grown past $100,000, mostly through steady contributions and a financial advisor named Trevor Banks, who I trusted because he never once tried to sell me something flashy. Trevor believed in slow and boring, same as I did, and we got along fine for that reason. I made supervisor at the plant in 1998, which came with a decent raise. And I put almost all of that raise straight into the account instead of upgrading my truck like half the other men on the floor did. Margaret used to laugh and call me the last honest man in Mecklenburg County. I took that as a compliment then, and I still do now. When Ryan graduated college in 2013, I helped him with the down payment on his first apartment, no strings attached, because that is what a father does. When he married Chloe in 2021, I paid for half the wedding without blinking, because I loved my son, and I wanted him to start his life without a mountain of debt hanging over him. I want that on the record early in this story, because what happened later was never about money I was unwilling to share. I had shared plenty over the years, freely, without keeping score. What happened later was about something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with generosity and everything to do with respect. By the time I retired in 2023, that account sat at $480,000, and it was, without a single exception, the proudest financial achievement of my entire life. Not because of the number itself, because of every ordinary Tuesday it took to get there. I met Chloe Ashford for the first time at a barbecue Ryan threw at his apartment in the spring of 2020, and I will tell you honestly that my first impression of her was not bad. She was polished, quick with a compliment, the kind of woman who remembered small details about your life and brought them up later to make you feel important. She asked me about the plant, about Margaret's garden, about a fishing trip I had mentioned once in passing. I drove home that night and told Margaret, who was still alive then and already sick, that Ryan had found himself somebody sharp. Margaret, who had a gift for seeing past a person's surface faster than anybody I ever knew, just nodded slowly and said, "Sharp is one word for it." I did not understand what she meant until years later. Chloe grew up in a family that valued appearance the way my family valued discipline. Her father ran a car dealership in Gastonia that did well for a while, and then did not. And I got the sense, never confirmed, never spoken out loud, that Chloe had grown up watching money come and go fast, learning to enjoy it while it lasted, and never quite learning how to build it slow. That is not a crime. Plenty of good people grow up that way and turn out fine. But it shapes how a person thinks about other people's money, and I would learn that the hard way. The wedding in 2021 was lovely. 300 guests at a venue out near Lake Norman, and I paid for half of it without complaint, because Margaret had passed the year before, and I wanted, more than anything, to see my son happy about something. Chloe hugged me at the reception and called me Dad for the first time that whole night, and I remember feeling something loosen in my chest, some old guarded part of me deciding maybe I had been too hard on her. Maybe Margaret's read on people had finally missed one. Over the next 2 years, small things started collecting the way small things do. The kind of things that seem like nothing on their own but add up if you are paying attention. Chloe mentioned once at Thanksgiving, casual as anything, that it was strange how some families kept everything so separate, quite looking right at me when she said it. Another time she asked, out of nowhere over coffee, how exactly my account with Trevor Banks was set up, whether it was a trust, whether Ryan was listed as a beneficiary. I answered her honestly because I had no reason not to. I did not think at the time that I was handing her information she would use. In February of 2024, I had a minor cardiac scare, nothing as serious as it sounded on the phone that morning, a blockage they caught early and cleared with a stent, 3 days in the hospital, and then home with a fistful of new prescriptions and a doctor's warning to slow down. Ryan drove me to every appointment that week, sat with me in waiting rooms, brought me soup from the place on South Boulevard I liked. I want to say clearly that Ryan, on his own, has always had a good heart. He showed up for me that February the way a son should show up, and I have never forgotten it. It was during that hospital stay that the subject of my accounts came up for the first time in a serious way. I was lying in a bed at Novant with an IV in my arm, and Ryan, worried and well-meaning, asked whether I had given anybody access to my finances in case something happened to me while I was unconscious or unable to think clearly. It was a fair question, a responsible question even. So when I got home, I called Trevor Banks and set Ryan up as what the bank called a view and bill pay authorized user, which meant Ryan could look at the account and pay a bill from it in an emergency, but could not move money, could not add anybody, could not change a single thing about who owned what. Trevor explained the limits to me twice, made sure I understood them, and I signed the paperwork sitting at my own kitchen table with a cup of coffee going cold beside me. I told Ryan about it over dinner a week later. I remember his exact words. He said, That makes sense, Dad, just for emergencies. And I believed him completely, because at that point in my life I had no reason not to. What I did not know. What I would not learn for almost 2 years was that Chloe was in the room when Ryan told her about the arrangement. And, according to what I pieced together much later, she asked him a single question that night that changed the direction of everything that followed. She asked him, "Why does it only say your name and not mine too?" Looking back now, and I have had a lot of time to look back, I can count at least 6 separate moments over the following year and a half where Chloe tested the water on the subject of my money, each one a little bolder than the last. Each one dressed up as something innocent so that pushing back on it would have made me look paranoid or cheap. She brought up, more than once, how unfair it seemed that some parents left everything to their children automatically while others made things complicated with trusts and lawyers. She asked at a 4th of July cookout in 2024 whether I had ever thought about simplifying things while I was still around to help make the decisions myself, phrased exactly like she was doing me a favor. I remember one dinner in particular, October of 2024, at a steakhouse off Independence Boulevard that Ryan picked to celebrate his promotion at work. Chloe brought up, almost offhand between courses, that a coworker of hers had just been added to her own mother-in-law's accounts, and how nice it was that the family trusted each other that way, how it made everybody equal partners, instead of outsiders looking in. I remember feeling my stomach tighten at the phrase outsiders looking in, because that is exactly what she was calling herself. And I remember Ryan glancing at me quickly, checking my reaction, the way a son does when he already half suspects the answer he's about to get. I said nothing that night. I told myself I was being a difficult old man, holding on to control out of stubbornness instead of good sense. I told myself Margaret would have wanted me to be generous, to trust my son's choices, to stop treating every conversation about money like a chess match. I want to be honest with you watching this. Part of the reason I stayed quiet for so long was guilt. Guilt that I had never fully warmed to Chloe the way a father-in-law is supposed to. Guilt that maybe my own coldness was the real problem, not her questions. I did not know yet that Ryan and Chloe had run up almost $40,000 in credit card debt, financing a kitchen renovation, and 2 vacations Chloe had insisted on posting about online. I did not know they had already been turned down for a home equity loan that spring. I did not know how close to the edge they were actually standing, and how a father's careful, boring, $50 a week fortune must have looked to 2 people staring down debt collectors, like a rope thrown into deep water. Which brings me to the Thursday in question, a warm afternoon in late September. The kind of day in Charlotte where he is most broken, and you can sit on your porch without sweating through your shirt. I was 64 years old, 3 years into retirement, and I had spent that morning the way I spent most mornings, doing the crossword at my kitchen table with a pot of coffee, then working out in the backyard, tightening a fence post that had come loose in a storm the week before. My neighbor Walter Hines, retired postal carrier, 68 years old, and the closest thing I had left to a brother since Margaret's people mostly lived out of state, had walked over around noon the way he did most days, and we sat on my back porch eating sandwiches and talking about nothing in particular. The Panthers' chances that season, whether the Wilsons 2 doors down were ever going to fix that sagging gutter. Walter left around 2. I remember because I checked the clock right after he pulled out of the driveway, thinking I still had time to mow before it got too hot again. I went inside to get a glass of water, and that is when my phone rang, sitting on the kitchen counter next to the crossword I hadn't finished. Ryan's name lighting up the screen with a photo from 3 Christmases ago, back when things between us felt simpler than they turned out to be. I picked up on the second ring, same as I always did for my son, same as I had for 34 years of his life. "Hey, Dad," he said, and I could hear right away that something in his voice was different, lighter, almost giddy. The tone of a man about to tell you good news he's been sitting on for a while. "You got a minute?" "I've got something to tell you." I sat down slowly at the kitchen table, still holding the pencil from the crossword, and I said, "Sure, son. What's going on?" I had no idea, sitting there in my own quiet kitchen on an ordinary Thursday, that the next 90 seconds of my life were about to change everything. "So you know how you set me up on your account a couple years back," Ryan said. "Just to look at things, help with bills if you ever needed it." "I remember," I said, already feeling something small and cold start turning over in my stomach, though I could not have told you why yet. "Well," he said, and I could hear him grinning through the phone, could actually hear it. I was in there this morning paying that quarterly statement fee thing, and I got to thinking, Chloe's part of this family too, and it just didn't feel right that her name wasn't anywhere on there. So I called Trevor's office and I got it fixed. I added her as a joint owner on the account. Full joint, Dad. She's got just as much access as I do now. For a second, I genuinely did not understand the words. I sat there at my kitchen table with the pencil still in my hand, and I made him say it again in my head before it landed. My son had called a financial advisor's office, using access I had given him strictly to view balances and pay an emergency bill, and had somehow turned that into adding his wife as a full joint owner on an account with $480,000 in it. An account that had never, not once in 35 years, had any name on it but mine. "Isn't that great?" Ryan said. And in the background, faint but unmistakable, I heard Chloe's voice, bright and pleased, saying something I couldn't quite make out, followed by a small laugh, the kind of laugh people make when they think they've gotten away with something clean. "That's what family does, right, Dad?" Ryan said again, filling the silence. I hadn't realized I was leaving. "We don't keep things separate. We're not outsiders looking in." I heard Chloe's phrase come out of my son's mouth like it belonged to him, and something in me went very still and very quiet, the way a man goes still right before he does something he's going to remember for the rest of his life. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anybody of anything. I pulled my laptop over on the kitchen table, opened it, and logged into the Carolina Trust portal with hands that were, I noticed distantly, completely steady. The screen loaded, and there it was, right at the top under account holders, my name, and beneath it, added that very morning at 10:47 a.m., a second name I had never once authorized, Chloe M. Whitfield. I looked at that screen for a long moment, longer than felt natural, long enough that Ryan said, "Dad, you there?" I heard the laughter in the background finally starting to fade, Chloe going quiet. Sensing something in the silence that Ryan hadn't caught on to yet, I said 4 words, calm, even. Quiet enough that I had to say them clearly for him to hear me at all. "Show me the account." "What?" Ryan said. "Dad, I'm telling you, it's already done. I just told you, she's on there now, that's the good news." "I heard you," I said. "I want you to open the account on your own phone right now, while I'm on the line, and read me back exactly what it says under account holders. Both names, word for word." There was a pause, and I could hear the shift happening on the other end of that call, the exact moment a man realizes the reaction he expected is not the reaction he is getting. "Dad, why are you being weird about this? I thought you'd be happy. This is us trying to include her, trying to be a real family about things." "Ryan," I said, and I kept my voice level, the same voice I used to use on the plant floor when a piece of machinery was about to hurt somebody and there wasn't time for panic, only for clarity. "I did not authorize anybody to be added as an owner on that account. I gave you view access and bill pay access 2 years ago. For emergencies, nothing more. I want to know exactly how her name got on there this morning, and I want to know it right now." The laughter was completely gone by then. In the background, I heard Chloe's voice, sharper now, asking Ryan something I couldn't make out, and Ryan's voice pulling away from the phone slightly as he answered her, muffled, tense. "I don't understand why you're making this a thing," Ryan said when he came back. "I called Trevor's assistant. I told her I had access to the account and I wanted Chloe added. She said that was fine since I was already an authorized user. She processed it. It took like 10 minutes, Dad. I thought I was doing something nice." I closed my eyes for a second, sitting there in my kitchen, and I thought about 35 years of $50 bills, about Margaret and her garden, about every Sunday I hadn't gone out to eat, so that number on the screen could keep climbing. I thought about a bank employee taking my son's word for it over the phone and making a change to my life's work in under 10 minutes without ever once calling to confirm it with me. "I'm going to call Trevor myself," I said. "And Ryan, I want you to understand something. I am not angry at you for wanting your wife included in this family. I am asking how something like this happened without my knowledge or my signature. Those are 2 very different questions, and right now I only have an answer to one of them." I hung up the phone before he could respond. I sat at that kitchen table for a long time afterward, staring at my own reflection in the dark screen of my laptop, and I felt something I had not felt in years. Not rage, not yet. Something colder and more patient than rage. I felt the specific, focused clarity of a man who has just realized he needs to find out exactly what happened before he decides what he is going to do about it. I called Carolina Trust Investments the next morning at 9:02, 2 minutes after they opened, and I asked for Trevor Banks directly. Trevor and I had worked together for almost 20 years by that point, and I trusted him, which is exactly why what he told me that morning landed as hard as it did. Harold, he said, and I could hear immediately that he already knew what I was calling about, which told me something on its own. I want to walk you through this carefully, because I think there's been a misunderstanding on our end, and I take full responsibility for that. He explained that his assistant, a younger woman named Priya, who had only been with the firm about 8 months, had received a call from a man identifying himself as Ryan Whitfield, an existing authorized user on my account, requesting to add his spouse as a joint owner. Priya, according to Trevor, verified Ryan's identity using the security questions on file, confirmed he was listed as an authorized user, and processed the request, believing that an authorized user requesting to add a joint owner was a standard low-risk transaction, the same as updating a mailing address or a phone number. That's not how it should have worked, Trevor said, and to his credit, he did not try to soften it. Authorized users can view and pay. They cannot add owners. Full stop. That's a firm-wide policy, and Priya either didn't know it or didn't apply it correctly. I'm pulling the recorded call right now, and I want you to know, Harold, before we go any further, that I am reversing this change today. Chloe's name comes off the account by end of business, and I am personally overseeing it. I felt some of the tightness in my chest ease, hearing that, but not all of it. I appreciate that, Trevor, I do, but I need you to understand something. This isn't just a paperwork error to me. Somebody I have known for 4 years called your office, pretending he had the authority to do something he did not have the authority to do. And your firm let him. I want the recording. I want it in writing. And I want to know if this is the first time something like this has happened on my account, or if there's a history I don't know about. Trevor went quiet for a moment. Harold, there's something else. Priya mentioned Ryan referenced a form, said he had paperwork already signed by you authorizing joint ownership, and that he'd fax it over if needed, but she processed it before he actually sent anything, because his identity checked out over the phone. I sat with that for a long moment, feeling the cold, patient thing from the night before settle deeper into my chest. A form, I repeated. Trevor, I never signed a form. I know, he said quietly, which is why I think you and I need to figure out exactly what my son thought he had in his hand. I did not sleep well that night. I kept turning Trevor's words over in my head, the phrase, a form already signed by you, and no matter how many times I turned it, I could not make it fit with anything I actually remembered doing. I had signed exactly one piece of paperwork at Carolina Trust in the past 2 years, the authorized user form for Ryan back in February of 2024, the one Trevor himself had walked me through line by line at my own kitchen table. I remembered every detail of that morning, the coffee going cold, Trevor's reading glasses pushed up on his forehead, the specific paragraph about view and bill pay only, no ownership transfer authority, that he had actually read out loud to me before I signed. The next morning, Trevor called back with the recording of the call from Priya's line, and he sent it over as an audio file along with a scanned copy of what Ryan had apparently referenced. I sat at my kitchen table with my reading glasses on and opened the attachment, and there it was on my screen. A form, Carolina Trust letterhead, my name typed at the top, and at the bottom, a signature that was not mine, not close to mine, a loose scrawled version of my name that somebody had clearly copied off another document without ever having watched me actually sign anything in their life. Beneath the signature line, a notary stamp. A real one, from an actual licensed notary named Grace Odom, dated 11 days before that Thursday phone call. I felt something shift in my chest reading that date. 11 days. This had not been a spur-of-the-moment decision Ryan made on a Thursday morning while paying a bill. Somebody had planned this out, gotten a form notarized, and been sitting on it for almost 2 weeks, waiting for the right moment to use it. I called Ryan that afternoon, and I kept my voice even, the same way I had on the first call, because I have learned over 64 years that a calm voice gets you further than a loud one ever will, and because I genuinely did not yet know how much of this my son had understood versus how much had been done around him. I need to ask you something serious, I said, and I need you to tell me the truth, because I already have most of the answer and I just want to hear it from you. Did you sign a form 11 days ago in front of a notary named Grace Odom, authorizing Chloe to be added to my account? There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I knew before he said a single word. Dad, he finally said, and his voice had changed completely from the excited, giddy tone of 2 days earlier. I think I need to explain some things to you. What Ryan told me that afternoon, sitting in his own car in a parking lot somewhere, his voice low like he didn't want to be overheard, was this. 2.5 weeks earlier, Chloe had come to him with what she called a good idea, a way to make things simpler for the whole family. She had pulled up something online, a general template, and told Ryan it was just a standard update authorization, the kind of routine paperwork families fill out all the time to keep accounts organized. She had already filled in my name, my account information, details she had picked up over the years from casual conversations at dinners and cookouts. Things I had mentioned without ever imagining they were being filed away. She told Ryan that since he already had legal access to the account as an authorized user, all he needed to do was sign it, on my behalf as my representative, and take it to get notarized, and everything would be squared away properly, instead of doing it the awkward way by making his father feel put on the spot. Ryan, by his own account, did not read it carefully. He trusted his wife. He signed where she told him to sign. In a version of my handwriting she had apparently practiced from an old birthday card I'd written him years before, and the two of them drove together to a UPS store on Providence Road, where a notary named Grace Odom notarized it, believing, because Ryan told her so directly, that he was there with his father's full knowledge and consent. She told me it was legal because I already had access, Ryan said, and I could hear something breaking in his voice, some slow dawning realization moving through him as he said it out loud to me for the first time. She said families do this stuff all the time, that it wasn't a big deal, that you'd probably never even notice the difference since I already had access to look at everything anyway. Ryan, I said quietly, you signed my name on a legal document. You had it notarized. That is not a family shortcut. That is forgery. And depending on how this gets handled, it could be a serious crime, not just for Chloe, but for you. The silence that followed was different from any silence we had ever shared before. 34 years of father and son compressed into the quiet static of a phone call in a parking lot. When he finally spoke again, his voice was small in a way I had not heard since he was a boy. I didn't think of it that way, he said. I swear to you, Dad, I didn't think of it that way. I believed him, for what it's worth, that he had not sat down and consciously decided to commit forgery against his own father. I have known my son his entire life, and whatever else is true about him, I do not believe Ryan Whitfield wakes up in the morning plotting to hurt people, but belief in his intentions did not change the facts sitting in front of me, and I have never been a man who lets good intentions excuse bad actions, mine or anybody else's. Margaret used to say that the road to a lot of ruined families is paved with people who didn't mean anything by it, and I thought about her saying that more than once over the following days. I called an old coworker from the plant, a man named Danny Ossie, who had retired a few years before me, and whose daughter, it turned out, practiced elder law right here in Charlotte. Danny gave me her number that same afternoon, and I called Denise Marsh's office the next morning and got an appointment for that Friday. Denise's office was a modest one on East Boulevard. Nothing flashy, which I appreciated, because I have never trusted people who spend other people's crises on decorating their waiting rooms. She was a sharp woman in her 50s, direct in a way I liked immediately, and she listened to my entire story without interrupting once, taking notes on a yellow legal pad the old-fashioned way. Mr. Whitfield, she said when I finished, I want to walk you through exactly what happened here in plain language, because I think it's important you understand the full weight of it before we decide what to do. What you're describing is not a family misunderstanding. It's a textbook case of financial elder abuse, and I use that phrase deliberately, even though I understand it's uncomfortable to apply it to your own son and daughter-in-law. Someone forged your signature on a legal document, had it fraudulently notarized, and used it to gain ownership access to a substantial portion of your life savings. That is a crime under North Carolina law, regardless of the family relationship involved. I sat with that word, abuse, for a long moment. It did not feel like the right word for what had happened to me, not at first. Abuse was something that happened to frail old men in nursing homes, not to a 64-year-old who still mowed his own lawn and fixed his own fence posts. But sitting in Denise Marsh's office that Friday morning, I slowly understood that the law did not care how strong or capable I felt. It cared about what had actually been done, and what had actually been done had a name, and the name was abuse. What are my options? I asked her. if I want to protect what's mine without necessarily destroying my family in the process. Denise leaned back in her chair. Let's talk about that, she said, because you have more of them than you probably think. Denise Marsh laid it out for me clearly, the way I imagined she had laid it out for dozens of other people sitting in that same chair before me, people who had trusted somebody they loved and gotten burned for it. She said I had three basic paths in front of me, and none of them were mutually exclusive. The first was purely financial. I could work with Carolina Trust to fully reverse the joint ownership, which Trevor had already started, and I could go further by restructuring the account entirely, moving it into a revocable living trust with strict, lawyer-drafted terms about who could access it, and under what conditions, terms that would be far harder to manipulate than a simple bank authorization form. The second path was legal. I could report what had happened to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's Office as forgery and attempted financial exploitation, which would open a formal investigation into both Ryan and Chloe, and depending on what that investigation found, could result in criminal charges. The third path, and Denise was careful to say this was not a legal path so much as a personal one, was about how I chose to handle my relationship with my son and his wife going forward, separate entirely from whatever I decided to do about the money and the law. You do not have to decide all three of these today, Denise told me. Most people in your position want to protect the money first, because that's the part that feels most urgent and most fixable. The relationship questions tend to sort themselves out slower, and often not the way people expect going in. I asked her what she meant by that. People come in here furious, she said, ready to cut off a child completely, press every charge available, and by the time the paperwork is actually filed, half of them have softened, and the other half have gone further than they originally planned, because the process itself reveals things they didn't know at the start. I'm not telling you which kind of person you'll turn out to be. I'm telling you it's common, and it's nothing to be ashamed of either way. I left her office that Friday with a folder full of paperwork, a plan to move the account into a properly protected trust within the next 2 weeks, and a decision for the moment to hold off on calling the DA's office until I understood the full picture of what Chloe had actually done, and how much of it Ryan genuinely had not understood. I was not ready yet to decide my son's fate with a phone call made in anger. I wanted facts first. I have always wanted facts first. Before I did anything else, I wanted to talk to the notary myself, the woman named Grace Odom, whose stamp sat under that forged signature. I found the UPS store on Providence Road easily enough. A small strip mall location with a shipping counter up front and a notary desk tucked in the back corner, and I asked to speak with Grace directly, explaining briefly that I had a question about a document she'd notarized. Grace turned out to be a woman in her 40s. Careful and a little nervous once I explained the situation, and to her credit, she pulled her notary journal without hesitation. The log every notary in North Carolina is legally required to keep of every document they process. She found the entry from 11 days before that Thursday, and she turned the book around so I could see it myself. My name, typed in the signer column, an address that was mine, and beside it, a signature that Grace herself had watched somebody produce right there at her desk. Was it me who signed this? I asked her, already knowing the answer but needing to hear it from her directly. Grace's face went pale. The man who came in identified himself with a driver's license, she said slowly, pulling up something on her own records. I remember him specifically because he seemed nervous, kept glancing at his phone like he was checking a message before each page. I asked for ID, standard procedure, and he showed me a North Carolina license. Whose license? I asked, though I already suspected. She checked her log again. Ryan Whitfield, she read out. That's the name on the ID I recorded, and there it was, laid out plainly by a stranger with no reason to lie to me. Grace Odom had not notarized my signature. She had watched Ryan Whitfield sign my name, using his own valid identification to verify himself, not me, which meant either Grace had made an error in her process, or, more likely, Ryan had told her something that made the whole thing seem legitimate. Did he say anything about who the signature belonged to? I asked. Or why he was the one signing? Grace thought for a moment. He said he had power of attorney, she said. He told me he was authorized to sign on his father's behalf. I didn't ask to see the power of attorney document itself, which I should have. I take full responsibility for that. I'm required to verify the identity of the person in front of me, which I did, but I should have asked for proof of that authority before I notarized a signature made on someone else's behalf. That's a mistake I made, and I'm sorry for it. I thanked her, and I meant it, because unlike some of the other people involved in this story, Grace Odom owned her part in it without flinching. But her honesty also told me something important. Ryan had not just signed my name at Chloe's suggestion. He had told a licensed notary, out loud in a specific and deliberate lie, that he held power of attorney over me. That was not confusion. That was a story he had chosen to tell. I called my daughter Megan that Sunday, our regular call, the one she had never once missed since Margaret died, and I told her everything, start to finish. The phone call from Ryan, the forged signature, Grace Odom's notary book, Denise Marsh's office. Megan listened without interrupting, the same way I had listened to Denise, and when I finished, she was quiet for a long moment. I need you to know something, Dad, she finally said, and I hate that I'm only telling you this now instead of 2 years ago. Chloe asked me once, at your birthday, how much you had in your accounts, not in a normal way. She made it sound casual like small talk, but she asked twice, from two different angles in the same conversation. I brushed it off at the time, because I didn't want to start something with my brother's wife over what felt like nothing. I've regretted not saying anything to you about it ever since. I sat with that for a moment, feeling something harden further in my chest, not toward Megan, who had done nothing but stay quiet the way any of us might in that situation, but toward the pattern now confirming itself from a second direction. You did nothing wrong, I told her. None of us wanted to believe something like this about somebody in our own family. That's not a character flaw. That's just how families work until they don't. Megan offered to drive down that week, and I told her to wait until I had a clearer sense of where things stood, because I did not want this to become a war with sides drawn before I had even decided what kind of fight, if any, I wanted to have. But before we hung up, she said one more thing that stuck with me for days afterward. Dad, she said, Ryan's not a bad person. I really believe that. But he spent his whole marriage letting Chloe make the decisions and just going along with it, because it's easier than fighting her on things. I don't think he forged your signature because he wanted to hurt you. I think he did it because saying no to his wife has always been harder for him than saying yes to something wrong. I thought about that for a long time after we hung up, sitting alone in my kitchen with the crossword from days earlier still unfinished on the table. It did not excuse what had happened, but it gave me, for the first time since that Thursday phone call, a slightly clearer picture of exactly what kind of battle I was actually fighting, and against whom. Trevor Banks called me that Monday morning to confirm that Chloe's name had officially been removed from the account, effective immediately, and that he had personally flagged my file with an internal note requiring any future changes, of any kind, to go through a verified in-person or notarized video call directly with me, no exceptions, no matter who called claiming authorization. He also told me something else, something that made the whole situation feel even more deliberate than it already had. Harold, I pulled the login history on your account going back 6 months, he said. There were 4 separate login sessions using Ryan's authorized user credentials in the 2 weeks before the change was made. Each one lasted between 20 and 40 minutes. Each one only looked at your holdings, your balances, nothing else. No bill payments were made during any of those sessions. I asked him what that meant, though part of me already understood. It means somebody was studying the account before they made their move, Trevor said carefully. Checking the exact balance, probably figuring out the best time to make the change. Maybe waiting for a moment when the market was up so the number would look as impressive as possible when they told you about it. That detail sat heavy with me for the rest of that day. It was one thing to imagine Chloe convincing Ryan to sign a document out of laziness or misplaced trust in a single impulsive afternoon. It was another thing entirely to imagine somebody logging into my private financial information 4 separate times over 2 weeks, watching the number, waiting for the right moment, the way a person watches a house before deciding when to break in. I asked Trevor to remove Ryan's authorized user access entirely, not just the ownership piece, and he did it that same day. It felt strange, cutting my own son off from something I had given him in good faith after a health scare, something meant as a safety net in case I ever needed him. But a safety net that somebody else was using to study my finances in secret was not a safety net anymore. It was a door I had left unlocked, and I finally understood I needed to close it. I told Walter Hines everything that same week, sitting on my back porch with 2 glasses of sweet tea going warm between us, because Walter had earned the right to hear it straight, having sat on that porch with me through Margaret's illness and through every hard season since. Walter did not interrupt while I talked, same as Megan hadn't, same as Denise Marsh hadn't, and when I finished, he sat quiet for a long moment, looking out at my backyard like he was working something out in his head before he said it out loud. "You know what gets me, Harold," he finally said, "is that you gave that boy everything a father's supposed to give. College, half a wedding, a down payment on an apartment, time. You gave him time, which is the one thing none of us ever get back. And somewhere along the way, he let somebody talk him into thinking the only thing that was ever really missing was your bank account. I didn't say anything to that, because there wasn't much to say. That wouldn't have cracked my voice, and Walter, who had known me long enough to read that kind of silence correctly, let it sit there between us without pushing. "I'll tell you something else," he said after a while. 30 years I carried mail on these streets. You learn a lot about people watching what shows up at their door and what doesn't. The families that turn out all right, generally, aren't the ones with the most money. They're the ones where everybody still shows up for each other when it's inconvenient. You showed up for that boy his whole life. Question now is whether he's willing to learn how to show up for you, even when it costs him something he doesn't want to pay. I thought about Clinton Webb, 4 houses down, the kind of neighbor who drops everything without a second thought, and I realized Walter was cut from that same cloth, the cloth that seemed to be getting rarer every year I lived. "I don't know what I'm going to do about Ryan yet," I told him honestly. "I know what I'm doing about the money. I don't know yet what I'm doing about my son." Walter nodded slowly, like that was exactly the right answer, the honest one instead of the easy one. "That's all right," he said. "You don't have to know both things at the same time. Fix what's broken first, the rest'll show itself." Ryan showed up at my house unannounced on a Wednesday evening, about 10 days after the phone call that started all of this, standing on my front porch, looking like a man who had not slept well in over a week, which, looking at him, I believed. I let him in, made coffee out of habit more than hospitality, and we sat across from each other at the same kitchen table where I had first read his mother's handwriting in dozens of birthday cards over the years, where I had signed the original authorized user form 18 months earlier, believing I was doing something smart and safe for both of us. "I talked to a lawyer," Ryan said, before I could say anything at all. "Not about fighting you, Dad. I want to be really clear about that. I talked to somebody because I needed to understand how much trouble I'm actually in, and the answer scared me pretty badly." "What did they tell you?" I asked. "That forging a signature and getting it fraudulently notarized is a felony in this state," he said, his voice tight. "That even if you never press charges, what I did could still come up if the bank reports it, which apparently they're required to do in certain cases of suspected elder financial exploitation." He said the word exploitation the way a person says a word they've been avoiding out loud, like saying it made it more real than it already was. "Dad, I need you to know I did not understand any of that when I signed it. I know that doesn't fix it. I know that doesn't undo it, but I need you to hear me say it anyway." I studied my son's face across that table for a long moment, looking for the boy I had raised somewhere underneath the exhausted, frightened man sitting in front of me. "I believe that you didn't fully understand what you were doing in the moment," I told him honestly. "I don't believe that erases your responsibility for it. You are a grown man, Ryan, 34 years old. At some point, a person has to be the one who says no to a bad idea, even when the person handing it to them is somebody they love." "I know," he said quietly, and for the first time since that Thursday phone call, I heard something in his voice that sounded less like fear of consequences and more like actual shame. "I know that now. I didn't know it then. I wish to God I had." Over the next hour at that kitchen table, Ryan told me things I had not known. Pieces of the picture that Denise Marsh and Trevor Banks and Grace Odom had each handed me one at a time, but that Ryan now filled in from the inside, from the actual conversations that had happened in his own house over the past several months. He told me that he and Chloe had been carrying almost $42,000 in credit card debt since the kitchen renovation the year before, a renovation Chloe had pushed for hard, insisting their old kitchen was embarrassing to have friends over to see. He told me they had applied for a home equity loan in the spring and been denied, and that the denial had triggered a fight between them that lasted the better part of a week, a fight where Chloe had said, more than once, that it shouldn't be this hard for a family with a father-in-law worth almost $500,000. I told her that was your money, not ours, Ryan said, staring down at his coffee like the cup itself had answers written on it. I told her you'd worked your whole life for it, and it wasn't fair to think of it that way. She didn't like hearing that. She started saying things like, "What's the point of family if we can't help each other?" And eventually, I stopped arguing back because it was easier than fighting about it every single night. He told me about the day she brought him the form, how she framed it as something practical rather than something deceptive. How she had said the words, "He already trusts you with the account, this just makes it official," enough times that it had started to sound reasonable to him. The way anything starts to sound reasonable if you hear it repeated with enough confidence by somebody you love and trust. I should have called you, Ryan said. Before any of it, I should have just called you and asked, straight out, whether you'd be willing to add her yourself. If you'd said no, I should have accepted that and left it alone. Instead, I let her convince me there was a shortcut, and I took it, and I told myself the whole time it wasn't really lying, because technically I had access to the account anyway. I sat quiet for a moment, turning that over. There's a difference, I finally said, between access and ownership. You knew that difference, Ryan. Somewhere in you, or you wouldn't have needed a fake signature and a notary stamp to make it happen. If it had really been nothing, you could have just called me and asked. He didn't argue with that, he just nodded, slow and heavy. And for the first time that evening, he looked like a man who had actually run out of excuses to offer, even to himself. Just as I thought we might be reaching some kind of honest, if painful, understanding, Ryan said something that made the whole conversation take a sharp turn I had not seen coming. "There's one more thing I need to tell you," he said, "because I think you should hear it from me instead of finding out some other way." He shifted in his chair, not meeting my eyes. "After you called Trevor and had my access removed, Chloe was furious. Not scared furious, angry furious. She said something to me that night that I haven't been able to stop thinking about since." "What did she say?" I asked, already feeling that cold, patient thing in my chest sharpen back into focus. "She said maybe this whole situation proves you're not thinking clearly anymore," Ryan said, his voice dropping like he was ashamed to even repeat it. "That a man your age, living alone, making sudden decisions about lawyers and freezing accounts over what she called a simple misunderstanding, might be a sign that somebody should look into whether you're able to manage your own finances at all." She used the word guardianship, Dad. She said it like it was a real option worth considering. I sat very still. In 35 years of factory floors and family dinners and every hard season life had thrown at me, I do not think anything had ever gone quite as cold through my chest as those words did, hearing that the woman my son married had, within days of being caught forging my signature, already floated the idea of having me declared legally incompetent to control my own life. "Did you agree with her?" I asked, keeping my voice as level as I could manage. "No," Ryan said quickly, looking up at me for the first time in several minutes, something fierce and frightened moving across his face at once. "Dad, no. I told her that was insane, that you're sharper than most people half your age, that what you did wasn't confusion, it was exactly the opposite. It was you seeing clearly for the first time in months. We had a huge fight about it. I told her if she ever brought that idea to an actual lawyer, I would tell you myself, before she got the chance. And yet here we are," I said quietly, "with you telling me yourself." Ryan nodded, and something in his face told me he understood, finally and completely, that whatever line existed between loyalty to his wife and loyalty to the truth, he had just chosen, for the first time in a long while, to stand on the side of the truth. I called Denise Marsh first thing the next morning, and told her what Ryan had said about guardianship, and her tone shifted immediately from the measured, patient voice she'd used in our first meeting to something sharper, more focused, the voice of a professional who has just heard a threat she takes seriously. "Harold, I want you to understand something clearly," she said. "A guardianship petition against you would almost certainly fail, because you are, by every account you've given me, entirely capable of managing your own affairs. But I have seen families use the threat of a petition, or even file a frivolous one, purely to intimidate an elderly relative into backing down from protecting their assets. It rarely succeeds in court, but it can be exhausting, expensive, and deeply painful to go through, even when you win. So what do?" I asked her, "to make sure it never gets that far?" Denise laid it out step by step. First, she wanted me to get a full cognitive evaluation from my primary care doctor. Not because there was any real concern about my mental state, but because having a clean, documented, Dated evaluation on record would eliminate any possible argument before it could even be made. Second, she wanted to accelerate the trust paperwork we had already discussed, moving the account fully into an irrevocable structure with clearly documented terms, witnessed and notarized properly this time, with no ambiguity for anybody to exploit. Third, and this part she said carefully, watching my face as she said it, she wanted me to start keeping a written record, dates and details, of every interaction I had with Ryan and Chloe going forward, in case any of it ever became relevant in a legal proceeding. I don't want to live like that, I told her honestly. Keeping notes on my own family like I'm building a case file. I understand, Denise said. But Harold, I want to be honest with you the way I'd want a lawyer to be honest with me. You are already, whether you like it or not, a man that somebody in your family tried to defraud, and then, when that failed, at least considered trying to have declared incompetent. That is not a normal family disagreement anymore. That is a situation that calls for documentation, whether it feels comfortable or not. I sat with her words for a long moment, feeling the shape of my own life shifting under me in a way I had not expected. When I woke up that Thursday morning 3 weeks earlier, still believing my biggest concern that day was a loose fence post in my backyard, I made the appointment with my primary care doctor, a careful, thorough man named Dr. Raj Patel, who had been treating me since before Margaret got sick, and I told him plainly why I was there, that I wanted a full cognitive evaluation on record, not because I suspected anything was wrong, but because I needed documentation to protect myself from a family member who had suggested I might not be fit to manage my own finances. Dr. Patel did not treat the request as strange. He told me, in fact, that he saw more of this than people would guess. Older patients coming in for exactly this reason, wanting evaluations on file not because of symptoms, but because of family conflict over money. He ran the standard tests, the memory recall exercises, the questions about dates and names and simple math, the drawing of a clock face that apparently tells doctors more about a person's cognitive state than most people would expect. I answered everything easily, and at the end of the appointment, he sat back in his chair and smiled at me in a way that told me the results before he said a word. Harold, your cognitive function is excellent for your age, honestly excellent for any age, he said. I'll have the full written report to you within the week, dated and signed, and I'll keep a copy on file here permanently in case you ever need it again. I thanked him and stood to leave, but he stopped me at the door with one more thing. Can I ask what happened, he said, that made you feel like you needed this? I told him, briefly, the shape of it, the forged signature, the account, the word guardianship, spoken by a daughter-in-law who had known me 4 years. Dr. Patel's face changed as I talked, something professional, slipping for a moment into something more personal. I see this exact pattern more than people realize, he said quietly. It rarely starts with guardianship. It usually starts small, exactly the way you're describing. A little access here, a little confusion there, and then, if the first attempt gets caught, the next move is often to suggest the victim themselves is the one who can't be trusted. It's a well-documented pattern in elder exploitation cases. I'm glad you're taking it seriously this early, Harold. A lot of people don't until it's much further along. I drove home that afternoon with his words sitting heavy in my chest, the phrase well-documented pattern turning over and over in my mind, and I understood, more clearly than I had at any point since that Thursday phone call, that what had happened to me was not some isolated, personal failure of trust between a father and a son. It was something with a name, something with a shape, something that had happened to enough other families that a doctor could recognize it from a 2-minute description in his office. Denise Marsh and I spent the better part of 2 weeks building what she called an irrevocable trust, a legal structure far more resistant to manipulation than the simple brokerage account I had held for 35 years. She walked me through every clause, slowly, patiently, making sure I understood not just what each section said, but why it existed, what specific vulnerability it was designed to close. The trust named me as the primary beneficiary during my lifetime, with strict, unambiguous language about who could access funds and under what documented circumstances, none of which could be changed by a phone call, an authorized user login, or a single notarized form. Any future changes would require, at minimum, a documented meeting with Denise's office directly, my own physical presence, and a mandatory 72-hour waiting period before anything could be finalized, specifically designed to prevent exactly the kind of fast, quiet maneuver that had almost worked on me. For the question of beneficiaries after my death, Denise asked me a question that sat with me for several days before I could answer it honestly. "Do you want Ryan included?" she asked. "And if so, under what terms?" I thought about that question longer than any other decision in the entire process. Part of me, the angry part, the part still replaying that giddy phone call and the word guardianship, wanted to write my son out completely, punish him the way a betrayal like that seemed to deserve. But another part of me, the part that remembered him as a boy bringing me dandelions from the backyard and calling them flowers for Mom, could not make myself do it. In the end, I told Denise I wanted Ryan included as a beneficiary, but structured very differently than before. Instead of a lump sum he could access freely, or worse, that a spouse could ever have direct claim to, I set up stage distributions tied to specific ages, fully protected from any current or future spouse's claim, through a clause Denise called a spendthrift provision, language that legally prevented creditors, and specifically prevented a divorcing or manipulative spouse, from ever touching those funds directly. Chloe, by contrast, I removed entirely, from every document, every designation, every possible future claim. Not out of pure spite, though I won't pretend a piece of me didn't want that too, but because trust, once broken in the specific and deliberate way she had broken it, is not something I believe should simply be handed back because time passes and holidays keep happening. I set up a separate education fund for any future grandchildren, structured so it could never pass through Ryan or Chloe's hands directly, funded but firewalled, protected the way I now understood, painfully, that everything I had built needed to be protected going forward. Chloe called me herself for the first time about 3 weeks after that original Thursday phone call, and I almost didn't answer, staring at her name lighting up my screen for a long moment before I finally picked up, curious, if nothing else, what she thought she was going to say. "Harold," she said, her voice warm in a way that felt rehearsed, practiced, the same tone she'd used at that very first barbecue years ago. I wanted to call and clear the air myself. I think there's been a lot of miscommunication, and honestly, I feel terrible that things have gotten so tense between us over what really was just us trying to include everybody properly. "Chloe," I said, keeping my voice even, "you had Ryan sign my name on a legal document and get it notarized without my knowledge. That is not a miscommunication, that's forgery." There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before she recovered. "I understand why it looks that way," she said, but Harold, families do things informally all the time. I never meant for it to feel like we were going behind your back. I just thought, since Ryan already had access, it would save everybody the hassle of a whole formal process. "The formal process exists for a reason," I said. "It exists so that a man doesn't wake up one day and find out his life savings have a stranger's name attached to them without his knowledge. You didn't save anybody hassle, Chloe. You took something that wasn't yours to take. And you had my son commit a crime to help you do it." Her tone shifted then, the warmth draining out of it quickly, replaced by something sharper, something closer to what I imagined she actually sounded like when nobody was performing for an audience. "I think you're being incredibly dramatic about this, Harold. Nobody stole anything. The money's still all there. You got your little bank freeze, you got your lawyer. Isn't that enough? Do you really need to make Ryan out to be a criminal over something we did for the family?" "I heard you considered having me declared legally incompetent," I said, watching for her reaction even though I couldn't see her face. "Was that also for the family?" The silence that followed told me everything I needed to know, longer and heavier than any answer she could have given. When she finally spoke again, her voice had gone flat, all pretense of warmth completely abandoned. "I don't know where you heard that," she said, "but I think this conversation is over." She hung up before I could respond, and I sat there in my kitchen holding the phone, feeling, for the first time since that whole ordeal began, something close to relief. Not because the conversation had gone well, because for the first time, I had heard exactly who I was actually dealing with, without a single word of performance left standing between us. Megan drove down that weekend, finally having waited patiently, as I'd asked, while the legal and financial pieces settled into place. And she spent most of Saturday with me at the house, helping me go through the last of the paperwork Denise's office had sent over. But it was what happened Sunday, when she drove over to see Ryan on her own, without me, that ended up mattering more than either of us expected. She told me about it that evening, over dinner, the two of us back at my kitchen table, the same table that had held so many hard conversations over the past month. She said she found Ryan alone at his apartment, Chloe apparently staying with her sister for a few days, and that he looked, in Megan's words, like a man who hadn't slept properly in weeks. I didn't go easy on him, Megan told me. I told him straight out that what he did to you was unforgivable on its face, and that I didn't care how much Chloe had pushed him into it, because at some point a grown man has to be the one who says no. He didn't argue with me. He just sat there and took it, which honestly surprised me a little. She said Ryan told her something he hadn't yet told me directly, that he and Chloe had been fighting almost constantly since the account situation blew up, fights that had started over the guardianship comment and had since spread into everything else, the debt, the renovation, years of small resentments that had apparently been sitting under the surface long before any of this happened. Megan said Ryan admitted, quietly, that he was starting to wonder whether the marriage itself had been built on something a lot less solid than he'd let himself believe. He asked about you, Megan said, kept asking if you hated him. I told him I couldn't answer that for you, that it wasn't my place, but that from what I could see, you weren't a man who hated easily. You were a man who protected himself carefully, which isn't the same thing, even if it looks similar from the outside right now. I sat with that for a long moment, turning my coffee cup slowly on the table between us. Did you tell him I hated him? I asked, though I already knew the answer. No, Megan said, because I don't think that's true, and I don't think you think it's true either, even if you're not ready to say so yet. I sat with the decision about criminal charges for almost a full month before I finally made up my mind, turning it over during long walks around my neighborhood, during quiet evenings on Walter's porch, during more than one sleepless night, staring at the ceiling of the bedroom I used to share with Margaret. Denise Marsh never once pushed me in either direction, which I respected, because I have known plenty of professionals over the years who make their living pushing clients toward the choice that benefits them most, rather than the one that actually serves the client, and Denise was clearly not that kind of lawyer. In the end, I decided to go to the Mecklenburg County District Attorney's office, not with the goal of seeing my son locked away, which was never something I actually wanted, but because I believed, after a great deal of thought, that consequences matter, and that a family cannot simply absorb an act like forgery and fraudulent notarization and pretend it was a misunderstanding without some kind of formal accountability attached to it. I met with an assistant district attorney named Robert Chen, a careful, unemotional man who listened to my account of events with the same measured attention Denise had shown weeks earlier, and who explained, once I finished, exactly what my options looked like from the state side of things. Because I was the victim and the primary witness, Robert told me, my cooperation and my stated wishes would carry real weight in how the case proceeded, even though the ultimate decision on charges rested with his office rather than with me personally. I told him plainly that I wanted Chloe held fully accountable for what I believed was the driving force behind the entire scheme, but that I wanted the door left open for Ryan, specifically because of his cooperation, his honesty once confronted, and the fact that he had been the one to warn me about the guardianship comment rather than let it happen in silence. That's a common request, Robert told me, and it's one we can often work with, particularly when there's a clear difference in culpability and a documented pattern of one party being more directly responsible than the other. I can't promise you an outcome today, Mr. Whitfield, but I can promise you we'll take this seriously, and that your input will matter throughout the process. I left that meeting feeling something I hadn't expected to feel, a strange, quiet steadiness, not triumph, not satisfaction exactly, but the specific relief of a man who has finally handed a heavy thing to people whose job it is to carry it properly. While the DA's office began its own investigation, running its own subpoenas on financial records I had no direct access to, pieces of Chloe's history started surfacing that none of us had known before, the kind of information that only comes out once official channels start looking closely at somebody's past. Robert Chen's office found, through routine background work, that Chloe had a prior incident on record from 6 years before she ever met Ryan. A civil dispute with an elderly aunt in South Carolina over a car title that had been transferred under circumstances the aunt's family had called suspicious at the time. Though no criminal charges had ever been filed, and the whole matter had eventually been settled quietly within the family. I learned about this from Denise, who had been kept loosely informed as the victim's attorney, and I sat with the news for a long time, feeling less shock than I expected to feel. Somewhere underneath the anger and the betrayal of the past month, a colder, more analytical part of me had already suspected that what happened to me was not a first attempt by Chloe at something like this. People do not simply arrive, fully formed, at the idea of forging an elderly relative's signature. That kind of confidence, that specific comfort with the mechanics of deception, notary offices and template documents, and the careful cultivation of a trusting relationship, usually comes from practice. Even if the practice was smaller, quieter, and successful enough the first time that nobody ever spoke of it again. I called Megan to tell her what I'd learned, and she went quiet on the phone for a long moment before she spoke. That explains something Ryan mentioned once, early on, when they were just dating, she said slowly, piecing together a memory. He said Chloe didn't get along with her aunt in South Carolina, said there'd been some kind of falling out over money years before. But he made it sound like the aunt was just difficult, unreasonable. I never thought twice about it. Neither had I. Back when I first heard secondhand gossip about Chloe's complicated family relationships, chalking it up, the way people often do, to ordinary family friction rather than a pattern worth examining closely. It is a strange and uncomfortable thing. Learning that warning signs existed years before you ever met somebody, sitting quietly in a story you were never told the full version of, waiting for the right moment to matter. Denise and Robert Chen both agreed, for different reasons, that it would be useful, both legally and personally, to have one final documented conversation with Ryan and Chloe together before the DA's office made its formal charging decision. Denise arranged it at her own office, rather than a restaurant or either of our homes, a neutral space with her present the entire time, both to protect me and, as she put it plainly, to protect the integrity of anything said in that room, in case it mattered later. Ryan came looking pale and nervous, sitting stiffly in the chair across from me. Chloe came too, though it was clear from the moment she walked in that she had been talked into it rather than choosing it herself, her arms crossed, her expression somewhere between defensive and openly hostile. Denise opened the meeting by laying out, calmly and without embellishment, exactly what the investigation had found so far: the login history, Grace Odom's notary journal, the recorded phone call with Priya, the South Carolina incident from years before Chloe ever met Ryan. Chloe's composure held for the first several minutes, offering the same rehearsed explanations she had given me over the phone weeks earlier, framing everything as an overreaction to a family shortcut nobody had meant any harm by. But when Denise mentioned the South Carolina car title, calmly, without accusation, simply as a documented fact the investigation had surfaced, something in Chloe's face changed completely, the practiced warmth dropping away all at once like a mask coming loose. "That has nothing to do with this," Chloe snapped, her voice sharper than I had ever heard it. "That was a completely different situation. My aunt was confused about what she'd agreed to. That's it. That's all that ever happened. Confused the same way you suggested Harold might be confused." Megan said quietly from the chair beside me, the first thing she had said the entire meeting, and the room went completely silent. Chloe's face went red, then pale, and for a long moment nobody said anything at all. Ryan, sitting between his wife and the rest of his family, looked down at his own hands like he could not bring himself to look at anybody in that room, and in that silence, more than in anything said out loud that afternoon, I understood that whatever had existed between Ryan and Chloe was already breaking apart under its own weight, long before anybody in that room decided anything official at all. Ryan called me 3 days after that meeting in Denise's office, and I could hear immediately that something in him had shifted, some final piece of denial finally giving way under the weight of everything that had come out in that room. He asked if he could come by the house alone, without Chloe, and I told him yes, because whatever else was true, I still wanted to hear whatever he had to say directly, face to face, the way things between a father and son ought to be said. He sat across from me at the kitchen table again, and this time there was no nervous energy in him, no scrambling explanation, just a kind of tired, settled honesty that I had not seen in him since he was a much younger man. "I told Chloe I'm moving out," he said. "Not forever, necessarily. I don't know yet what happens with the marriage long term. But I can't keep living like this, watching her twist every hard conversation into something that's never actually her fault. The South Carolina thing, Dad. She's been doing this before I ever met her, and I spent years making excuses for the small stuff because I didn't want to believe I'd married somebody capable of the big stuff. What do you want to happen with the DA's office?" I asked him directly, because I owed him that honesty as much as he owed me his. Ryan was quiet for a long moment. "I think I deserve whatever comes to me for signing that document," he finally said. "I'm not going to fight that, and I'm not going to ask you to protect me from it just because I'm your son. But Dad, if there's any way you can make sure the record is clear about how much of this was her idea, her planning, her template, her handwriting practice, I'd be grateful. Not to get myself off the hook completely, just so it's not remembered like I was the one who orchestrated all of it." I sat with that for a long moment, studying my son's face, looking for any trace of manipulation in it, and finding, as far as I could tell, none. "I already told Robert Chen the same thing," I said. "That's not me protecting you out of blind love, Ryan. That's me telling the truth as I understand it. You made a serious mistake. You also told me the truth eventually, when it would have been easier not to, and that matters to me more than you probably know." He nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders eased slightly, like a weight he'd been carrying without realizing how heavy it had gotten. "I don't expect things to just go back to normal," he said. "I know I broke something that might not fix all the way. I just wanted you to know I understand that now, completely, in a way I didn't 3 months ago." Robert Chen's office took the case to a grand jury in late November, almost exactly 2 months after that first Thursday phone call, and I sat through the process the way Denise had prepared me to, giving my testimony plainly and without exaggeration, letting the documented evidence, the notary journal, the login records, the recorded call with Priya, do most of the heavy lifting rather than relying on the emotional weight of my own account. Grace Odom testified as well, honest and thorough about her own role and her own mistake in not verifying the power of attorney claim before notarizing the document, and her testimony, I later learned, actually helped establish clearly that Ryan had made a specific, deliberate false statement to a licensed official, not simply signed something in a moment of confusion. The grand jury returned an indictment against Chloe for forgery and attempted financial exploitation of an elder adult, a specific charge under North Carolina law designed exactly for situations like mine, situations where somebody uses deception to attempt to gain control over an older adult's assets. Ryan was charged separately with forgery, a lesser but still serious charge, reflecting his direct role in physically signing the document. But the grand jury's presentment specifically noted the disparity in culpability between the two. Language that Robert Chen told me privately would likely matter a great deal when it came time for sentencing recommendations, assuming either case proceeded to a plea or a trial. I remember sitting in my truck in the courthouse parking lot after hearing the news, feeling an odd mixture of things all at once: relief that the process had recognized what I had believed all along about who bore the heavier weight of responsibility, sadness that it had come to indictments and courthouses at all, and underneath both of those, something quieter and steadier, a sense that I had done what needed doing, carefully and without cruelty, protecting myself without losing myself in the process. Walter was waiting for me on my porch that evening when I got home, the way he seemed to sense, without ever being told, exactly when I needed to have company most. We didn't talk much about the indictments themselves. We just sat there with our sweet tea, watching the last of the daylight go orange over the Wilson sagging gutter 2 doors down. And for the first time in 2 months, I felt something close to peace settle over that particular corner of my life. Chloe's case moved through the system over the following several months, her attorney negotiating carefully with Robert Chen's office. And in the end, rather than risk a trial with the kind of documented evidence stacked against her, she accepted a plea agreement. She pled guilty to attempted financial exploitation of an elder adult, a felony under North Carolina law, and received a sentence that included 2 years of active probation, mandatory restitution covering the legal fees I had incurred through Denise's office, a formal record that would follow her for the rest of her life, and, perhaps most significantly to me, a permanent civil judgment establishing clearly and legally that she had knowingly attempted to defraud me. I did not go to the sentencing hearing feeling triumphant, the way I might have expected to feel back in that first cold week after the phone call. I went feeling mostly tired, the kind of tired that comes from carrying something heavy for a long time, and finally being allowed to set it down. Chloe did not look at me during the hearing, not once, and I found that I did not particularly need her to. I had gotten what I actually needed months earlier, sitting in Grace Odom's UPS store notary corner, hearing a stranger confirm plainly what had actually happened to me, without performance, without excuses, just the simple documented truth. Ryan's case resolved differently. reflecting the grand jury's noted disparity in responsibility. His attorney negotiated a deferred prosecution agreement, meaning that if he completed a period of supervised probation, community service, and a financial literacy and family mediation program the court required, his charge would ultimately be dismissed and eventually expunged from his record entirely. Robert Chen told me privately that this kind of outcome was fairly rare and reflected, in his professional opinion, both the clear evidence of Chloe's greater culpability and my own consistent documented statements throughout the process that Ryan's honesty once confronted had mattered to me. I felt, watching that part of the process resolve, something I had not expected to feel toward my son again so soon. Not full forgiveness, not yet, that would take longer, take more time and more proof than a single court hearing could provide. But something adjacent to it. Something like the beginning of a bridge being rebuilt, plank by careful plank, the same slow, patient way I had built that $480,000 in the first place. Ryan filed for divorce that spring, roughly 6 months after everything began, and he told me about it over dinner at a barbecue place on South Boulevard, the same kind of place we used to go when he was younger, and things between us were simpler. He said the decision had not come easily, that some part of him had spent months hoping the marriage might survive once the legal dust settled, but that watching Chloe throughout the entire process, watching her deflect blame at every turn, watching her show no real remorse even after the plea, had finally convinced him that whatever he had originally fallen in love with had either never fully existed or had long since eroded into something he no longer recognized. She asked me once, during the worst of it, Ryan told me, pushing food around his plate without really eating it, whether I was going to choose her or my father. Like it was that simple. Like loyalty only ever runs in one direction, and you have to pick a side and stay there, no matter what the other side actually does. He looked up at me across the table, something raw and honest in his face that reminded me, briefly and painfully, of him as a boy explaining why he'd broken something he wasn't supposed to touch. I think about that question a lot now. I think the real answer is that loyalty isn't supposed to mean defending somebody no matter what they do. I think it's supposed to mean telling them the truth, even when it costs you something. I failed that test with you for a long time, Dad. I don't want to fail it again with anybody else, ever. I did not tell him everything was fine, because it was not entirely fine yet, and I have never believed in telling my children comforting lies just to smooth over a hard moment. But I told him I was proud of him, for the divorce, for the honesty, for finally choosing the harder, truer path instead of the easier, more comfortable one, and I meant every word of it as much as I have ever meant anything. The divorce finalized that August, quiet and uncontested, Chloe moving back to Gastonia to live near her father, and Ryan moving into a smaller apartment across town, starting over in a lot of ways at once, his marriage, his finances, still recovering from the debt that had started this entire chain of events, and slowly, carefully, his relationship with me. It was around this time, roughly 7 months after that Thursday phone call, that my granddaughter Emma, Ryan's 15-year-old daughter from a brief relationship before he ever met Chloe, a girl I had always stayed close to even during the years, Chloe made family gatherings feel stiff and complicated, came to visit me on her own one Saturday afternoon, riding her bike over from her mother's house a few streets away the way she had done since she was old enough to be trusted on the road alone. We sat on the back porch, same spot where Walter and I had sat through so much of that hard year, and Emma, who has always had a directness about her that reminds me powerfully of Margaret, looked at me for a long moment before she asked the question that had clearly been sitting with her for a while. "Grandpa, do you hate my dad?" she asked. "Like, for what he did with the money thing." I heard my mom and my aunt talking about it, and I've heard some of it from Dad too, and I just want to know what you actually think. Not what everybody's version of it sounds like. I thought carefully before I answered her, because I have never believed in giving children, even sharp, direct teenagers like Emma, an answer simpler than the truth actually is. I don't hate your father, I told her. I was angry at him for a long time, and honestly, some of that anger hasn't fully gone away yet, and it might take a while longer before it does completely. But hating somebody and being disappointed in a choice they made, even a serious one, aren't the same thing, Emma. Your father made a bad decision. He let somebody talk him into something he knew, somewhere inside himself, wasn't right. But he also told me the truth once I asked him directly. Even though the truth was going to cost him something, And that told me something important about the kind of man he still is underneath the mistake. Emma nodded slowly, turning that over the way I could tell she did with most things, carefully, without rushing to a conclusion. He talks about it a lot, she said. More than I think you know. He told me once that the whole thing taught him he'd been letting other people make his decisions for him his whole life, and that he didn't want to keep doing that, especially not with me. I felt something loosen in my chest hearing that, some tight guarded thing I had been carrying since that first phone call, finally easing just slightly. That's a hard lesson to learn at 34, I told her. But it's a good one to learn eventually, whenever it happens. Better late than never, as your grandmother used to say. I spent time that fall thinking carefully about the education fund Denise and I had set up months earlier for future grandchildren, and I realized, sitting with Emma on that porch, that I had been thinking about it too narrowly, imagining only children who did not yet exist rather than the granddaughter who had been part of my life for 15 years already, steady and unwavering through every difficult season, including this one. I called Denise that Monday and asked her to help me set up a specific protected fund for Emma's college education directly, structured the same careful, firewalled way as everything else now, completely outside of Ryan's control, completely outside of any future spouse either of us might one day have to worry about, funded and locked in a way that no phone call and no forged signature could ever touch. When I told Emma about it a few weeks later, sitting again on that same porch, she cried, which surprised me because Emma has never struck me as a girl who cries easily. You didn't have to do that, she said, wiping her eyes with the back of her hand. Especially after everything that happened this year, I'd understand if you wanted to be more careful with people right now instead of setting up more accounts. That's exactly why I did it the way I did it, I told her. Careful doesn't mean closed off, Emma. Careful means doing things the right way, with the right protections, so that trust doesn't have to be a gamble anymore. I trust you. I've trusted you your whole life, and nothing that happened this year with your dad and Chloe changes that. This isn't me being reckless. This is me being exactly as careful as I've always tried to be, just smarter about how I show it. She hugged me tightly on that porch, the kind of hug that made me think, briefly and warmly, of Margaret hugging our own children on that same porch decades earlier, and I understood, sitting there in the fading light, that whatever else this whole ordeal had cost me, it had also, unexpectedly, clarified something valuable. It had taught me exactly who in my family deserved the deepest, least guarded version of my trust, and exactly how to protect that trust going forward without ever having to close my heart off completely to earn that protection. Ryan completed the financial literacy and family mediation program the court had required as part of his deferred prosecution agreement that winter, and he told me afterward that it had changed how he thought about money and marriage in ways he hadn't expected going in, treating it at first as simply a hoop he needed to jump through to keep his record clean. The program included sessions on recognizing financial manipulation within families, on healthy boundary setting between spouses, and uncomfortably for him, a full module specifically on elder financial exploitation, taught by professionals who worked directly with families exactly like ours. I sat in that room, Ryan told me one evening over dinner, listening to a counselor describe the exact pattern of what happened to us, step by step. Like she'd been reading our story out of a textbook instead of describing something that actually happened to real people. Isolating a trusted family member's information. Testing boundaries gradually. Finding the specific access point that seems small and harmless. Escalating once trust is established. Suggesting incompetence if the first attempt gets caught. He shook his head slowly. I kept thinking, I lived this, and I still couldn't see it happening in real time. That scared me more than almost anything else that's happened this whole year. I told him that scared me too, honestly, hearing it laid out that clearly, because it meant what had happened to our family was not some freak accident, some unique cruelty that had simply found its way to us by chance. It was a documented, recognizable pattern, common enough to have its own counseling curriculum, which meant somewhere out there, other families were living through some version of the exact same thing at that very moment. Some further along, some just beginning to notice the small, easily dismissed signs the way I had for over a year before I finally understood what I was looking at. I want to do something with what I learned, Ryan said, and I could hear something new in his voice, something that sounded for the first time in a long time, like genuine purpose rather than guilt. Not right away. I know I've got a lot of rebuilding to do first, but eventually, maybe I could help other people see it sooner than I did. Warn families before it gets as far as it got with us. I told him that sounded like a good use of a hard lesson, and I meant it, watching my son across that table, seeing for the first time in almost a year something that looked less like a man drowning in his own mistakes and more like a man slowly, carefully, learning how to build something better out of the wreckage. A year passed the way years do, once the sharpest edges of a crisis start to dull into something more like memory than open wound. The account, fully protected now inside Denise's carefully constructed trust, had grown steadily through another year of quiet, boring, disciplined management, the same way it had grown for 35 years before Chloe ever entered my life. Proof that the slow and careful approach Margaret and I had built our whole marriage around still worked exactly as well as it always had, once the wrong hands were finally kept away from it. Chloe, as far as I knew, had settled back into life near Gastonia, working, I heard secondhand, through people who still knew her family, at a car dealership not unlike her father's old one, and I made a conscious decision, somewhere in that second year, to stop tracking her movements even secondhand, because I had come to understand that carrying her around in my thoughts any longer than necessary was its own kind of unpaid debt I did not owe her. Ryan had rebuilt slowly but steadily, paying down the debt that had started this entire chain of events, moving into a modest apartment he could actually afford without the pressure of Chloe's spending, pulling at every paycheck, and spending far more time with Emma than he had. During the years his marriage had quietly consumed most of his attention and energy. He called me every Sunday now, too, the way Megan always had, an unspoken new tradition that had formed sometime over that first difficult year, without either of us ever explicitly deciding to start it. I found myself, that second autumn, sitting on my back porch with Walter one warm afternoon, thinking about how strange it was that the worst betrayal of my life had ultimately led to some of the most honest conversations I had ever had with my son. Conversations that might never have happened at all, if everything had simply continued smoothly, if Chloe's scheme had worked cleanly and quietly, and I had never noticed the missing piece until it was far too late to do anything about it. You ever think about how close it came to just working? Walter asked me that afternoon, echoing something I had turned over in my own mind more times than I could count. If that assistant hadn't mentioned the form, if Ryan hadn't been the one to tell you about the guardianship idea instead of letting it happen quiet, you might never have caught any of it until it was already too late to undo. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of that thought the way I'd felt it many times before. I think about it plenty, I said. It's part of why I don't regret being careful, even now, even with things mostly settled. Careful is the only reason any of this turned out the way it did instead of some much worse way. It was during that second year that I finally understood something Trevor Banks had mentioned almost in passing, months earlier, that I had let slide past me at the time without fully appreciating its significance. Trevor had told me during one of our regular check-ins on the Trust's performance that Carolina Trust had quietly updated its internal training protocols, firm-wide, following what happened on my account, specifically requiring any authorized user requests to add or change ownership status to go through a mandatory secondary verification call directly with the primary account holder, no exceptions, regardless of how confident the caller sounded or how legitimate any accompanying paperwork appeared. Your situation became a case study, Harold, Trevor told me. Not with your name attached, obviously, privacy rules, but the specific pattern of what happened to you, the authorized user overstepping their limited access, the forged form, the notary who wasn't shown proof of power of attorney. All of it got folded into new training everybody in the firm goes through now. What happened to you is preventing this exact thing from happening to somebody else. I sat with that for a long time after we hung up, feeling something unexpected move through me, a strange, quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with punishment or revenge, and everything to do with the simple fact that my worst year had produced, almost by accident, a small piece of protection for strangers I would never meet. I thought about all the other Harold Whitfields out there, other careful, disciplined people who had spent decades building something slowly, who might now be just slightly safer, because a young assistant somewhere at Carolina Trust had been trained to ask one more question before processing a request that sounded routine but wasn't. I mentioned this to Denise during one of our final wrap-up meetings on the trust paperwork, and she told me something that stuck with me even longer than Trevor's news had. "This is actually incredibly common, Harold, more than people realize," she said. "Almost every meaningful consumer protection in elder financial law exists because one specific family went through exactly what you went through, and instead of just quietly absorbing it and moving on, somebody documented it clearly enough that it could be used to protect the next person. You did that, whether you set out to or not." I told her I hadn't been trying to be some kind of example when I called her office that first frightened week, hadn't been thinking about anybody but myself and my own account. She smiled at that, the first time I had really seen her smile in all our meetings together. "Nobody ever is at the start," she said. "That's usually exactly how the important protections get built anyway." Motivated partly by what Trevor had told me, and partly by something Ryan had said in his own counseling program about wanting to help other families, I made a decision that second year that I had never expected to make when this whole ordeal began. I worked with Denise to set aside a modest portion of my account, not a large amount, $10,000. Small enough that it would never meaningfully threaten my own security, but meaningful enough to matter. And I donated it to a local nonprofit here in Charlotte that provides free legal consultations to older adults who suspect they might be victims of financial exploitation, but cannot afford an attorney of their own to find out for certain. I did not do this looking for recognition, and in fact I asked the organization to keep my name off any public materials connected to the donation, because this was never, for me, about being seen as a generous or noble man. It was about the simple, uncomfortable fact that I had been lucky, in a strange and specific way, to have Trevor Banks as a longtime trusted advisor, to have Danny Osie's daughter practicing elder law right here in my own city, to have the resources to hire Denise Marsh the moment I suspected something was wrong. Plenty of people facing exactly what I faced do not have any of that. They do not have a Trevor, do not know a Denise, cannot afford the kind of protection that let me move quickly and decisively before real permanent damage was done. Megan came with me the day I delivered the donation in person, despite my instructions to keep things quiet, insisting she wanted to be there for it, even if nobody else ever knew. Standing in that small nonprofit office off East Boulevard watching the director, a tired but warm woman named Sandra Phillips, explain how many calls they received every single month from frightened older adults who suspected a family member was taking advantage of them but had nowhere affordable to turn for real answers. I felt something settle in me that even the grand jury indictment and the guilty plea and the careful new trust structure had not quite managed to settle on their own. I had turned the worst thing that had ever happened to me into something that might, in some small way, help protect somebody I would never meet from going through the same thing entirely alone. I received an unexpected letter in the mail that second spring, handwritten, from Grace Odom, the notary from the UPS store on Providence Road who had unknowingly notarized Ryan's forged signature almost 2 years earlier. I had not spoken to her since that first afternoon I walked into her office asking to see her notary journal, and I was surprised, opening the envelope at my kitchen table, to find several careful, thoughtful paragraphs waiting inside. She wrote that she had thought about our conversation many times over the intervening months, that it had changed how she approached every single document that crossed her desk, that she now asked, without exception, for physical proof of any claimed power of attorney before notarizing a signature made on someone else's behalf, no matter how confident or familiar the person in front of her seemed. She wrote that she had actually caught 2 other attempted instances of exactly this kind of fraud in the month since, both times catching them before any document was ever notarized, both times because of the new questions she now asked every single time, questions she had only started asking because of what happened with my own case. She closed the letter by thanking me, of all things, for how I had handled that first conversation in her office, for not treating her with anger, even though her mistake had been a genuine link in the chain of what happened to me. She wrote that most people in my position, understandably, would have been furious with her, and that my calm, direct approach that day had actually made it easier for her to take real responsibility instead of getting defensive, which in turn had made her more likely to actually change her practices going forward, rather than just apologizing and moving on unchanged. I sat with that letter for a long time after I finished reading it, feeling something warm move through me that I had not expected a piece of mail to produce. I thought about how easy it would have been, that first week, to have stormed into her office demanding blood, treating her like an enemy instead of a person who had made an honest, correctable mistake. I thought about how differently things might have unfolded if I had chosen anger as my first instinct instead of the calm, careful patience Margaret had spent our whole marriage teaching me by example. I wrote Grace back that same week, telling her I was glad the whole ordeal had led to something protective on her end, too, and thanking her, in turn, for the honesty she had shown me that very first difficult afternoon. 2 years after that Thursday phone call, I hosted Thanksgiving at my house on Maple Ridge Drive for the first time since Margaret passed, something I had avoided doing for years. Telling myself the house felt too empty, too quiet, too full of a woman who was no longer there to fill it. But that 2nd November, something in me finally felt ready, and I called Megan and Ryan both, separately, and asked if they wanted to come. Megan arrived first, the way she always did, helping me in the kitchen the same practical way her mother used to, and Ryan arrived an hour later with Emma, who had turned 17 that summer and had grown, over the past 2 years, into the kind of sharp, steady young woman who reminded everyone at that table, in different quiet moments throughout the day, exactly why all of us had fought so hard to protect what mattered most. We did not talk much that day about everything that had happened. We had talked about it plenty in the 2 years since, in smaller, quieter conversations, on porches and over phone calls, and in Denise's office, and in a courthouse parking lot. And there is only so much a family needs to keep revisiting a wound before revisiting it stops being healing and starts being its own kind of harm. Instead, we talked about ordinary things, the way families are supposed to talk on holidays. Emma's plans for college, still a year off, but already exciting to think about. Megan's promotion at work. Ryan's slow, steady climb back toward financial stability, a climb he talked about now without shame, treating it as simply a fact of his life rather than something to hide. At one point, clearing plates after dinner, Ryan came up beside me at the sink, drying dishes the way he used to as a boy, back when Margaret would hand him a towel and put him to work whether he wanted the job or not. "Thank you for having us," he said quietly, not looking at me directly, focused on the plate in his hands. I know it probably wasn't an easy decision after everything. It wasn't, I told him honestly, because I have never believed in pretending things were simpler than they actually were, not even to make a nice moment feel nicer. But you've spent 2 years showing me who you actually are, underneath the mistake you made. That matters more to me than the mistake itself, even though the mistake was real and serious, and I'm never going to pretend it wasn't. He nodded, quiet for a moment, and then he said something that stayed with me long after that Thanksgiving ended. "I used to think being a good son meant never disappointing you," he said. "I think I understand now that being a good son actually means owning it completely when you do, instead of hiding from it or making excuses. I'm trying to be that kind of son now. I know it's late. I'm trying anyway." By that second Thanksgiving, the trust Denise and I had built together had grown to just over $530,000. Steady, careful growth accumulated the same slow, boring way the original 480,000 had been built decades earlier. Proof that nothing about the fundamental approach needed to change, only the protections surrounding it. I had made a few adjustments to the structure over those 2 years as circumstances shifted. Increasing Emma's protected education fund. Once it became clear she was seriously considering an out-of-state engineering program that would cost more than the modest amount I had originally set aside, and quietly, carefully, restoring a small measure of trust in Ryan's designation, not full access, not anything close to what had existed before, but a slightly expanded stage distribution, reflecting 2 years of consistent honesty and accountability. I want to be clear, watching this story unfold, from wherever you're watching it, that I did not do this because enough time had simply passed and I felt obligated to move on. I did it because Ryan had earned it, deliberately and specifically, through 2 years of actions rather than words, through Sunday phone calls that never once got missed, through a completed counseling program he had taken seriously, instead of simply enduring, through the quiet, consistent way he had shown up for Emma and for Megan, and slowly, carefully, for me, without ever once asking for the trust to be restored, without ever once making it about what he wanted instead of what he had actually done to deserve it back. Denise told me, during our last major review meeting on the trust that year, that what I had built was, in her professional opinion, About as protected as a family financial structure could reasonably be while still remaining warm and functional, rather than cold and purely defensive. A lot of people who go through what you went through end up building something so locked down it stops feeling like family money at all, she told me. It just becomes a fortress nobody can actually live inside of. You didn't do that. You built real protection, real consequences where they needed to exist, and you still left room for people to earn their way back in if they actually did the work. That's rarer than you'd think, Harold. I told her that was exactly what Margaret would have wanted. Careful without being cold, protected without becoming closed off entirely from the people I loved, and Denise, who had never met Margaret but had come to know her through 2 years of my stories about her, nodded like she understood exactly what I meant. Life has a way of reminding you that the hardest chapters of a story are rarely the ones you plan for, and midway through that second year, Walter Hines, 69 years old by then, was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. Caught fortunately during a routine screening, treatable, his doctors assured him, but serious enough to require real attention and real support through the months of treatment that followed. I drove Walter to every single appointment, the same way Clinton Webb had once driven a mother to a hospital, in a different family's story I heard about years later, the same way a good doctor simply shows up without being asked twice. I sat with him through consultations, brought him meals during the weeks his treatment left him too tired to cook for himself, and spent long afternoons on his own porch instead of mine, watching his backyard the way we had watched mine for so many years, talking about everything and nothing, the way old friends do when one of them is scared and doesn't quite want to say so directly. Funny how things work out. Walter said to me one afternoon, midway through his treatment, his voice tired, but his eyes still sharp. 2 years ago, you were the one going through hell, and I was the fellow bringing sweet tea and telling you it'd sort itself out. Now here we are, other way around. That's what neighbors are for, I told him, echoing, without fully realizing it at the time, something close to what he had told me during my own worst weeks. You showed up for me when I needed it. I'm not going anywhere now that you need it back. Walter's treatment went well, in the end his doctors declaring him cancer-free by that winter, and I remember sitting on his porch the day he got the news, both of us quiet for a long moment before he finally spoke. I've been thinking about something, he said. All those years I carried mail on these streets, watching which families showed up for each other, and which ones didn't. I used to think it was mostly about blood, about who was technically family and who wasn't. I don't think that anymore. I think it's about who actually shows up, blood or not. You taught me that as much as I ever taught you anything. I did not say much back to that, because there wasn't much that needed saying, just two old men sitting on a porch, grateful, in the particular quiet way men our age tend to be grateful, for each other, and for another season safely gotten through. Emma left for college that following fall, heading 3 hours west to study engineering at a school in the mountains, and I drove up with Ryan and Megan both to help her move into her dorm, the three of us hauling boxes and setting up a small refrigerator, and pretending, the way families do on moving days, that none of us were quietly emotional about the whole thing. Standing in the parking lot afterward, ready to say our final goodbyes before the long drive back to Charlotte, Emma hugged me tightly, longer than usual, and when she finally pulled back, she had tears in her eyes that she didn't bother trying to hide. I know I say this a lot, she said, but I really don't think I'd be standing here without what you did, Grandpa. Not just the money for school, though that obviously matters. The whole thing. Watching you handle everything that happened with Dad and Chloe, watching you be careful without being cruel, watching you protect yourself without shutting everybody else out. I learned more about how to actually be a good person from watching you get through that than from almost anything else in my whole life. I held on to that moment for a long time on the drive back to Charlotte, Ryan quiet in the passenger seat beside me, Megan following behind us in her own car, and somewhere around the halfway point of that drive, Ryan spoke up, his voice careful, thoughtful, the voice of a man who had been turning something over for a while before finally deciding to say it out loud. I think about that day a lot, he said. The phone call. I think about how excited I was, telling you what I'd done, thinking I was making you happy. I think about how differently everything could have gone if you'd just gone along with it that day instead of asking to see the account. I don't think I'd be the person I am now. I don't think Emma would have gotten the kind of grandfather she got to grow up with, watching you handle it the way you did instead of just letting it happen. You want to know something, I told him, keeping my eyes on the road ahead of us. I think about that day too, all the time. I've never once regretted those 4 words. Not for a single day since I said them. There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a house once the worst of a crisis has passed, once the lawyers have finished their work and the courts have handed down their decisions and the family has, slowly and imperfectly, begun rebuilding whatever pieces were still worth rebuilding. I found myself, in the 3rd year after that Thursday phone call, sitting alone on my back porch more evenings than not, and in that particular quiet, I thought about Margaret more than I had allowed myself to think about her in a long while. I thought about the way she used to talk about money, not as something to be hoarded or worshipped, but as something to be respected, earned carefully and spent thoughtfully, protected not out of greed but out of the plain, practical understanding that a lifetime of discipline deserved to be honored, rather than carelessly given away to whoever asked loudest or smiled warmest. I thought about a conversation we'd had once, years before she got sick, sitting on this same porch, when she told me that the hardest part of loving people completely was learning that love and trust, while they usually travel together, are not actually the same thing, and that a wise person learns, sooner or later, how to keep loving somebody fully while still protecting themselves from that same person's worst impulses. I had not understood, back then, sitting on that porch as a younger man with 2 kids still at home, and a life that felt uncomplicated by comparison, exactly how much wisdom was folded into that simple observation. I understood it completely now. 3 years removed from the worst betrayal of my life, having lived through exactly the situation, she seemed to be describing decades before it ever happened to either of us. I thought, too, about what she would have made of everything that unfolded: the forged signature, the notary journal, the courthouse, the plea deal, the slow, careful rebuilding with Ryan afterward. I believe, though I cannot know for certain, that she would have been proud of how I handled it, not because I won some kind of victory over Chloe, though I suppose in a narrow sense I did, but because I had managed to protect what we built together without becoming a bitter, closed-off man in the process, without losing my relationship with our son entirely, without letting the worst thing that ever happened to me become the thing that defined the rest of my life going forward. I said, out loud, to nobody but the quiet evening air of my own backyard, "I think we did all right, Margaret." And though nobody answered me back, I felt, sitting there in the fading light, a kind of peace I had not fully expected to find on the other side of everything that happened. Danny Osi, my old coworker from the plant, the man whose daughter had connected me with Denise Marsh in the very first week of this entire ordeal, stopped by my house that same year, something he did periodically since his own retirement. The two of us sitting on my porch, reminiscing about 35 years of factory floors and union negotiations, and the particular brand of exhausted satisfaction that comes from a hard, honest day's work. Denise mentioned your case to me once, in passing, without details, obviously, client confidentiality and all that. Danny told me that afternoon. But she said something that stuck with me. She said your file was one of the cleanest, most well-documented elder exploitation cases she'd ever handled, start to finish. Said most people come to her either too angry to think clearly or too embarrassed to move quickly enough, and you managed to do neither, somehow, right from that very first week. I thought about that for a moment, turning it over. I don't know that I felt clear-headed at the time, I admitted. I felt like a man whose whole life had been pulled out from under him in the space of a single phone call. But I suppose I've always been the type to think slow and careful when something matters enough, even when part of me wanted to just react. 35 years on a factory floor teaches you that. You don't touch a piece of machinery in anger. You figure out exactly what's wrong first, and then you fix it properly. Danny nodded slowly, understanding that comparison the way only another man who'd spent his life on that same factory floor could. You know, he said, I think about my own daughter sometimes, doing the work she does, seeing families come apart over exactly this kind of thing more often than people would ever guess. Makes me grateful my own kids never gave me a reason to worry about something like that. Makes me respect you more, honestly, for how you handled it when your own kid did. Ryan wasn't the architect of it, I reminded him, the same distinction I had made to Denise and to Robert Chen and to anybody else who asked over the past 3 years. He made a serious mistake, but he wasn't the one who built the scheme from the ground up. I know, Danny said. That's part of what impressed Denise too, from what she told me. That you kept that distinction clear the whole way through, even when you had every reason to lump them both together and be done with the both of them completely. Most people wouldn't have bothered making that distinction, not in the heat of it. You did. That takes a particular kind of discipline most folks don't have. I thought about that phrase, particular kind of discipline, long after Danny left that afternoon, and I realized it was, in a strange way, the same discipline that had built the account in the first place. Decades of small, careful, deliberate choices, applied this time not to money but to fairness, to making sure that whatever justice I sought was accurate rather than simply satisfying. Ryan came to me that same year with something he had been working on quietly for months, a small presentation he had put together, at first for his own church group and then, once word spread, for a senior center not far from my house, walking older adults and their families through exactly the pattern he himself had once been part of. The gradual testing of boundaries, the small requests that seem harmless in isolation, the specific danger of authorized access being mistaken for ownership authority. The warning signs that a family member's questions about somebody else's finances have shifted from casual curiosity into something more deliberate and concerning. He asked me, nervously, whether I would be willing to come and sit in the audience for one of these presentations, not to speak, not to be identified in any specific way, just to be there, and I agreed, curious to see what my son had built out of the wreckage of his own worst mistake. I sat in the back row of that senior center that Tuesday afternoon, watching Ryan stand in front of a room full of older adults and their concerned adult children, walking them through the exact mechanics of what had almost happened to our own family, careful never to identify specifics, never to mention Chloe by name, never to make the presentation about himself at all, but honest, in a broader sense, about how these things happen slowly, how they hide inside ordinary family conversations, how the people most vulnerable to this kind of exploitation are often, paradoxically, the most trusting, generous people, the ones who built something worth protecting precisely because they spent their whole lives being careful and disciplined and kind. Afterward, an elderly woman in the front row raised her hand and asked Ryan directly how he had come to know so much about this specific pattern, whether he had studied it professionally or experienced it somehow himself. I watched my son pause for a long moment, and then answer honestly, without excessive detail, without self-pity, simply stating that he had, several years earlier, made a serious mistake within his own family regarding exactly this issue, that he had been part of the problem rather than the solution, and that he had spent the years since trying to make sure other families recognized the warning signs sooner than his own family had. The room went quiet for a moment, and then the same elderly woman nodded slowly and said, "Well, I'd rather learn this from somebody who's actually lived through it than somebody who just read about it in a book." Several other people in the room nodded along with her, and I sat in the back row, watching my son take ownership of his worst mistake in front of a room full of strangers, turning it deliberately and without flinching into something that might genuinely help somebody else avoid the same painful path. Emma came home from college that winter break, 3 years older and considerably more grown up than the 15-year-old girl who had first asked me, sitting on this same porch, whether I hated her father. She sat with me again that visit, older now, more settled in herself, and she asked me a different question this time, one that told me how much both of us had changed since that first difficult conversation. "Do you think you'd do anything differently?" she asked. "If you could go back to that Thursday and do it all over again?" I thought about that question carefully before answering, the way I had learned to think carefully about most things over the past 3 years. "There are pieces I wish I could have skipped," I told her honestly. "I wish Ryan had never signed that document in the first place, obviously. I wish Chloe had never come into our family carrying whatever it was inside her that made all of this possible. I wish I hadn't had to learn Trevor's assistant's name through a fraud investigation instead of just a normal conversation about my portfolio. But the way you handled it once it happened," Emma pressed. "Would you change any of that?" I shook my head slowly. "No," I said. "I think about those 4 words a lot, Emma. Show me the account. I could have gotten angry that day. I could have shouted, accused, made it into a screaming match right there over the phone. Might have felt satisfying in the moment. But it wouldn't have gotten me the truth. Wouldn't have gotten me the notary journal, or Trevor's login records, or your father's honesty once he finally understood what he'd actually done. Staying calm, asking the right question instead of making the loudest accusation. That's what actually protected this family in the end. Not anger. Patience and clear thinking, applied the same careful way I applied it to everything else in my life. Emma sat with that for a long moment, watching the same backyard we had both watched so many times over the years, and then she said something that stayed with me long after that visit ended. "I think that's the thing I'm going to remember most, honestly," she said. "Not that something bad happened to our family. Every family has something bad happen eventually. What I'm going to remember is that you showed all of us what it looks like to handle something bad the right way. Careful, honest, fair. Even when being fair was probably the hardest option available to you." I did not have much to say back to that, sitting there on my own porch with my granddaughter beside me, the same porch where so much of this story had unfolded, piece by careful piece. Over the past 3 years, I just reached over and squeezed her hand, and we sat there together in comfortable silence, watching the light fade slowly over Maple Ridge Drive, the way it always had, the way I suspected it always would. 5 years passed from that ordinary Thursday afternoon to the day I am telling you about now. 5 years that carried this family through a courthouse, a divorce, a cancer scare, a college graduation, and slowly, patiently, a kind of rebuilding I could not have imagined possible, sitting at my kitchen table that first cold week, staring at a stranger's name on my account, and wondering if I would ever trust anybody in my own family again, the way I had before that phone call came through. Ryan, now 39, remarried that 5th year, a woman named Patricia he had met through, of all places, the very senior center program he had started building years earlier. A soft-spoken occupational therapist who worked with some of the same elderly clients his presentations reached. I met her several times before the wedding, watched carefully, the way I imagine any father in my position would watch, looking for the same warning signs I had missed the first time, the careful testing questions, the casual curiosity about numbers that didn't belong to her. I found none of it. Patricia asked me, once gently, whether I had any family recipes she should learn for holidays, and that was about as close as our conversations ever came to the subject of money, which told me, more than any background check could have, exactly what kind of woman my son had chosen the second time around. Emma graduated with her engineering degree that same spring, top of her program, and took a job with a firm in Charlotte specifically. She told me with a grin I recognized immediately as her grandmother's own stubborn grin, so she could keep an eye on the old man, a joke that carried underneath it something real and steady that I did not take for granted for a single day. Chloe, I learned eventually, secondhand, through channels I no longer actively sought out but occasionally still crossed, had remarried as well to a man in Gastonia who ran his own small business. And I found, turning that news over the way I once might have turned over something sharper and more bitter, that I genuinely felt nothing but a distant, quiet indifference. Not forgiveness exactly. I do not think I ever fully arrived at forgiveness, and I am not certain I owe anybody an apology for that. But something had settled past anger into a kind of closed, finished chapter, the way a scar eventually stops hurting, even though it never fully disappears. The trust, by that 5th year, had grown to just over $600,000, protected the same careful way it had been protected since that first frightened week with Denise Marsh, growing steadily, boringly, exactly the way money is supposed to grow when nobody with bad intentions is allowed anywhere near it. Trevor Banks retired that year himself, and at his retirement dinner, held at a modest restaurant off Park Road, he pulled me aside and told me something I have thought about often since. "You know, Harold," he said, "in almost 40 years managing accounts, I've seen a lot of families go through exactly what you went through. Most of them either fall apart completely, or they paper over it and pretend it never happened, which usually just means it happens again, in a different form a few years later. You're one of the only clients I've ever had who did neither. You held people accountable, protected what was yours, and still somehow kept your family mostly whole on the other side of it. I don't know how common that actually is. I suspect it's rarer than any of us would like to believe." I told him it hadn't felt like some kind of achievement while I was living through it. It had felt, most days, like a man doing the next necessary thing, one careful step at a time, the same way I had built the account itself over 35 years, one $50 deposit at a time, never looking too far ahead, just handling whatever the next honest step in front of me happened to be. Chapter 48. Show me the account, I still think. Sometimes about that ordinary Thursday afternoon, the crossword unfinished on my kitchen table, Walter's truck just pulling out of my driveway, the phone ringing with my son's excited voice on the other end, telling me he'd done something he genuinely believed, in that first foolish moment, was going to make me proud. I think about the specific, cold clarity that settled over me the instant I understood what had actually happened. And I think about how close I came, in the space of those first few seconds, to simply going along with it, to swallowing my own instincts the way I had swallowed so many small warning signs over the previous 2 years, telling myself I was being paranoid, telling myself family doesn't need to be complicated, telling myself Chloe deserved the benefit of the doubt I had never quite been able to give her freely. I did not do that. I said 4 words instead. Show me the account, and in the 5 years since, I have come to understand that those 4 words were not really about the account at all, not fundamentally. They were about refusing to accept a story simply because it was told to me with excitement and confidence by somebody I loved. They were about insisting, even in a moment of shock, on seeing the actual truth for myself, instead of accepting somebody else's version of it secondhand. Every single piece of what happened afterward, Trevor's investigation, Grace Odom's notary journal, Denise Marsh's careful legal work, the grand jury, the plea deal, Ryan's slow and genuine rebuilding, none of it would have happened if I had simply said, that Thursday afternoon, "That's wonderful, son," and let the moment pass unquestioned. I think about Margaret often, sitting on this porch, and I believe, as much as a man can believe anything about somebody no longer here to confirm it, that she would understand exactly why I handled it the way I did. Careful, patient, unwilling to let anger make my decisions for me, but equally unwilling to let love talk me out of protecting what the two of us had spent our whole lives building together. She used to say that the people who raise you the best are the ones who show you, through their own example, exactly how to handle the worst day of your life when it eventually comes. I did not know, all those years watching her handle my father's death and her own long illness with that same quiet, dignified steadiness, that she was preparing me for a very different kind of worst day entirely. But I believe now that she was, in her own way, all along. If there is one thing I would want anybody listening to this story to carry away from it, it would be this. Trust and love are not the same thing as blind acceptance. You can love your family completely, generously, without reservation, and still insist on seeing things clearly before you hand over what you have spent a lifetime building. You can protect yourself without becoming cold. You can hold somebody accountable without destroying every bridge back to them. It is not always easy to find that balance, and I will tell you honestly, I did not find it perfectly. Not every single day of those 5 hard years, but I found it enough, carefully, one difficult decision at a time, the same slow and patient way I built everything else that ever mattered to me. People ask me sometimes, the few who know the whole story in detail, whether I ever worry it could happen again, whether I look at every new person who enters this family now with a kind of quiet suspicion I never used to carry before that Thursday afternoon. I tell them honestly that a small part of that watchfulness will probably never fully leave me, and I have made peace with that, the same way a man who breaks a leg badly enough sometimes favors it for the rest of his life, even after the bone has healed completely. But I tell them something else too, something I believe just as strongly. Watchfulness is not the same thing as fear, and it is not the same thing as bitterness. I did not come out of those 5 years a smaller, more guarded man. I came out of them, if anything, more certain of exactly who deserved my trust, and more willing to give it fully, deliberately, to the people who had actually earned it, Ryan, and Emma, and Megan, and Walter, and Patricia, rather than handing it out carelessly the way I once did, simply because somebody shared my last name or sat across from me at a holiday table. I think about Priya sometimes too, the young assistant at Trevor's office whose single mistake started this whole chain of events, and I find, 5 years removed from that first furious week, that I do not carry any real anger toward her at all. She made an error, a serious one, but an honest one, born of trusting a caller's confident voice over the firm's own careful protocols, and I understand now, better than I did then, that most of the damage done to families like mine rarely comes from a single villain acting alone. It comes from a whole chain of small, ordinary trust, extended in good faith at every link, until one person along that chain decides to abuse it deliberately while everybody else around them simply assumes the best, the way people generally do, the way I did myself for years longer than I probably should have. My name is Harold Whitfield. I am 69 years old now, and I still live in the same house on Maple Ridge Drive, still sit on the same back porch most evenings with Walter Hines, still get a phone call from my son every single Sunday without fail. The account is still there, protected, growing quietly, the way it always has, and someday it will pass to the people who have earned it, carefully, the way everything worth having in this life eventually should be earned. If you ever find yourself on the other end of a phone call that sounds like good news but sits wrong in your chest, I hope you remember this story, and I hope you find the courage to ask your own version of those same 4 words: show me the account. Sometimes that is all it takes to save everything you have ever worked for. If this story reminded you of your own family, or your own account, or your own quiet warning sign you've been talking yourself out of noticing, I hope you take it seriously before the excited phone call ever comes. Thank you for staying with Harold's story all the way to the end.